So why don't we get started, and I will hear appearances from both counsel, and I'll start with you, government.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Meredith Fenyo. Today I represent the United States government. I'm joined by my co-counsel, Maya Julian Kwong. While you won't be able to see or hear her throughout today's trial, she'll still be here helping with all of the technological features.
Good morning to you both. And may I hear appearances from defense counsel and your co-counsel?
Good afternoon, Your Honor, members of the jury. My name is Madeline Levin, and today I represent my client, Kara Bassett. I'm joined by my second chair, Mr. Jackson Cundy.
Good afternoon, Your Honor, members of the jury.
Good afternoon to both of you. Are we ready to get started with openings, or do we have anything that we need to handle before we dive right in?
The people have just a few preliminary matters we'd like to address.
Sure, you may proceed.
First, we'd just like the court to note that pursuant to pretrial order 7, exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted into evidence and can be referenced by either side at any time.
That is noted. Thank you for the reminder. And yes, please feel free to use those exhibits as you see fit. They are already in evidence.
Secondly, Your Honor, we'd like to invoke Rule 615, which states that all witnesses have been constructively sequestered.
Counsel for the defense, do you have any objection to the invocation of Rule 615? I assume that your client is present in the courtroom.
Yes, Your Honor, she's constructively present, though she won't be testifying in trial today. And it's our understanding that all witnesses are indeed constructively sequestered.
All right, Rule 615 is in effect and witnesses are constructively sequestered.
And lastly, Your Honor, we just like to ask the court's permission for all witnesses to be constructively pre-sworn prior to testifying pursuant to Rule 603.
That is fine with me. We will consider that they have all been sworn in.
And with that, the government is ready to proceed.
No further housekeeping matters from the defense. We're ready to proceed as well.
Wonderful. All right, then why don't we go ahead and proceed with our opening statements. And as a reminder for our jurors, everyone should make sure that they are in speaker view so that you are viewing the screen from the best viewpoint to observe openings. So I will go ahead and turn my video off, and government counsel, whenever you are ready, you may begin.
Yes, Your Honor. She wanted control, and she killed for it. It's August 18th, 2017, 11 p.m. The defendant, Kara Bassett, grabs a syringe of a lethal drug as she approaches her husband, and she injects him with it. He's dead. And then the defendant gets right to work covering up the crime she's committed. She gets into her husband's van and drives to a faraway swamp. She disposes of his body. A week later, she notifies the FBI, claiming her husband had gone missing, but members of the jury, her husband did not go missing. She killed him. Now, Kara Bassett, the defendant, and her husband, Don Clark, lived and worked at an elephant park. Mr. Clark was in control of the park, and he ran it like a business. But the defendant, she wanted something else entirely. A sanctuary. For 5 years, she pleaded with her husband to make the changes she wanted, but year after year, he didn't. The defendant was tired of waiting. She wanted control of the elephant park. She killed for it. That's why today we have charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with the murder of Don Clark. And as the people, we have the burden of proof in today's case. We have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant killed her husband and that she did so with malice aforethought, which just means she did so intentionally. And we're confident that will meet that burden. Because today you learned that the defendant had a motive, that she and her husband, they fought constantly about how to run the elephant park. You'll learn these arguments they built and built and built until the defendant had enough. She had her husband add a disappearance clause into his power of attorney, a clause that guaranteed that if Mr. Clark ever went missing, the defendant would gain control of all of his assets. His money, the elephant park, everything. And on August 18th, 2017, the defendant took advantage of that clause. Today, you'll learn exactly how the defendant killed her husband. You'll learn that this is a syringe of a lethal drug called carfentanil. It's 5,000 times more toxic than heroin. You'll learn the defendant had access to this syringe and that one went missing around the exact same time Dawn Clark disappeared. And then you'll learn what the defendant did right after she killed her husband. You'll be presented with GPS evidence that shows that Mr. Clark's van was driven 2 hours across Florida to a swamp called Big Gum Swamp. And you'll be presented with forensic evidence that proves it was the defendant who drove to that swamp to dispose of her husband's body. You'll learn that on August 18th, the defendant was wearing a pair of boots. These boots were found to have a rare combination of algae on them, and this algae, it matched that found at Big Gum Swamp. Now, members of the jury, when you hear all the evidence today, one thing will be clear about the defendant. She wanted control. She killed for it. That's why at the end of today's trial, I'm going to ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Opening statement from the defense, Your Honor.
Yes, you may proceed.
He wanted a new life. She wasn't part of it. Members of the jury, this case begins and ends with a failed marriage. A marriage between Kara Bassett and Dawn Clark, a marriage that ended. But not in the way opposing counsel just told you it did. Kara Bassett didn't kill her husband. He left her. Today, you'll hear the real story of what happened on August 18th. You'll learn how Dawn Clark walked outside of his home at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park and picked up his phone. He texted his wife for the last time. He said, "I'm going out for a while." Then he walked over to his van, got inside, and disappeared. Members of the jury, Dawn Clark abandoned his wife. Abandoned her after years of a tense relationship, after months of planning and finalizing a move to Costa Rica. You'll hear that just weeks before Dawn Clark went missing, he was in contact with his lawyer. He told his lawyer that he had off the books cash, that he had a vacation home in Costa Rica, that he wanted to keep everything a secret from his wife. And you'll hear that on August 18th, Dawn Clark was in contact with someone already in Costa Rica. He received 2 texts from that person. They said, "Call me immediately," which is exactly what Dawn Clark did. You'll hear Mr. Clark talk to that individual in Costa Rica for 52 minutes, and just hours later, he was gone. Members of the jury, today the government has charged Kara Bassett with first-degree murder. But they can't just tell you she's guilty. They have the highest burden in our criminal justice system, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They won't be able to meet that burden today. Because you'll hear from lead FBI agent Steph Branham. He'll tell you about his investigation, and when he does, I want you to keep 3 questions in mind. 1, did the FBI find any eyewitnesses who saw Miss Bassett at all on the night of August 18th? 2, did the FBI ever find Don Clark's body? And 3, did the FBI ever recover a murder weapon, that syringe of carfentanil they just told you about in their opening statement? Members of the jury, you'll learn the answer to all 3 of these questions is no. That's why no one, not even the government themselves, can tell you definitively Don Clark is dead. And you'll hear it's not just that they didn't find evidence, it's that they overlooked evidence. You'll hear Agent Branham never went to Costa Rica to look for Don Clark. You'll hear Agent Branham never found that individual Don Clark was talking to just hours before he disappeared. You'll learn the government never ruled out the reasonable possibility that Don Clark wanted a new life away from Kara Bassett. Because he had a plan. She was never a part of it. But the government is holding Miss Bassett responsible anyway. That's why at the end of today's trial, I'll ask you to find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
And before we proceed with evidence, I will take a moment to remind all of our scoring judges to please switch over to speaker view at this point in time so that we can see the advocates and the witnesses. Government, are you prepared to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Agent Steph Branham.
And good morning, sir. You are constructively sworn and under oath.
May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Agent Branham.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a senior special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And how much experience do you have as an FBI special agent?
I became a special agent in 2003, and since then I've investigated over 100 cases, including crimes such as murder, serial murder, gang crimes, robberies, and kidnappings.
And how'd you get involved in today's case?
Well, I was the lead investigator into the disappearance of Don Clark.
Now, when were you first notified about Mr. Clark's disappearance?
I became aware of his disappearance on August 25th of 2017, when his then wife, Kara Bassett, notified the FBI that he was missing.
And when did Miss Bassett claim Don Clark had first gone missing?
She claimed last seeing him on August 18th, 2017.
Now, what were the different steps of your investigation in today's case?
Well, ma'am, my investigation was broken down into 3 main parts: a search of Mrs. Bassett's place of residence, a search of a van, and interviews that we did with the defendant.
Let's go through those one by one, starting with your search of the Clark residence. Now, where did the Clarks live?
The Clarks lived at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
And when you searched the Elephant Park, did you find anything you believe could be related to a potential murder weapon?
Yes, ma'am. Through our investigation, we found that there was a syringe of elephant tranquilizer that was missing at the park.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation as to how this FBI agent knew that the syringe of carfentanil had gone missing.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
That was my next question.
Let's go ahead and lay that foundation, and then you may ask the question again. For now, the objection is sustained.
Motion to strike the testimony until that foundation is laid.
So stricken.
Now, what did you find when you searched the Elephant Park?
Yes, ma'am. We found that in a storage property at the Elephant Park, there were syringes of carfentanil, and in addition to that, there was a logbook that the park kept of those syringes, and we found one of those syringes to be missing.
And how did you determine that one of those syringes was missing?
Well, ma'am, the park kept a detailed logbook of who had checked out those syringes, and we found that there should have been 24 syringes when there were in fact 23 present.
Now, you mentioned that there was a missing syringe of carfentanil. Miss Jillian Kwong, can we get Exhibit 17 pulled up? Which is a pre-admitted copy of a drug safety sheet for carfentanil. Agent Branham, looking at this sheet, what does it tell us about the dangers of carfentanil?
Yes, ma'am. This data sheet shows that carfentanil is 5,000 times more toxic than heroin, and that only 1 milligram of this substance is lethal to human beings.
Now, did the defendant ever tell you that she was aware of these dangers?
Yes, ma'am. When we interviewed the defendant, she told us that she was aware that only a few drops of this substance could be lethal to a human.
And did the defendant ever tell you if a syringe of carfentanil had ever gone missing before?
Yes, ma'am. She told us that a syringe had never gone missing in the past.
Now, let's shift to that next step of your investigation, a search of a van. Now, whose van did you search?
The van was a Chevrolet Express. It was registered to Don Clark.
And how did you know it was registered to Don Clark?
Well, through our investigation, we determined all of the vehicles that were registered to Mr. Clark.
And where was this vehicle when you found it to search it?
We located the vehicle at the Cary Belle Lyon Airport, and it was there we were able to determine the van's previous location by accessing its GPS records.
Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 31 pulled up, which is a pre-admitted copy of the GPS data obtained by Agent Seth Branham and the FBI. Now, Agent Branham, can you walk the court through the route that Mr. Clark's van took on August 18th?
Yes, ma'am. On the 18th, the van left the property at 11:17 p.m. and drove 139 miles to the Big Gum Swamp. It stayed there for about 45 minutes, at which point it drove 132 miles back to the Cary Belle Lyon Airport.
And did you find anything that tied the defendant to driving that van?
Yes, ma'am. We found algae on the driver's side floor of that van, as well as the defendant's boots.
And how were you able to determine that there was algae on the driver's side of the van and on the defendant's boots?
Well, ma'am, we performed a forensic test that identified the type of algae present in the Big Gum Swamp. After comparing the algae we found at the swamp to the algae we collected from the driver's side floor of the van and Mrs. Bassett's boots, we found that the exact same type of algae was present on both of those.
Now, let's move to that last step of your investigation, your interviews with the defendant. When did you conduct your formal interview with the defendant?
Ma'am, we conducted dozens of interviews throughout our investigation, but our last formal interview with the defendant was on September 5th of 2018.
And when you interviewed the defendant, were you able to determine if she had a potential motive?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And what did you determine?
The defendant told us that she and her husband had disagreements about the way the elephant park was run.
Now, let's also talk about the defendant's behavior after August 18th. And Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 22 pulled up, which is a pre-admitted copy of the defendant's phone records from August 18th to August 26th. Now, Agent Branham, looking at this exhibit, is there any evidence the defendant tried to text her husband after he disappeared?
No, ma'am, there is no record of the defendant making any effort to send any texts after her husband's disappearance.
Is there any evidence the defendant tried to call her husband after he disappeared?
No, ma'am, there's not.
And how long did the defendant wait before notifying the FBI?
7 days, so an entire week, ma'am.
Now, Agent Branham, do you know who would gain control of the elephant park if Mr. Clark were to disappear?
Yes, ma'am. Through my investigation, I determined that Don Clark had in place a power of attorney agreement which granted Mrs. Bassett control over his assets in the event of his incapacitation or disappearance.
Now, you just mentioned disappearance as part of that power of attorney document. Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 4 pulled up, which is a pre-admitted letter from Mr. Clark's attorney to Agent Seth Branham. Now, Agent Branham, did Mr. Clark's attorney tell you anything about the irregularity of this disappearance clause?
Yes, ma'am. Don Clark's attorney told me that she had never seen a disappearance clause in her entire career.
And did Mr. Clark's attorney tell you who asked for that clause to be included?
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Tuminelli notified me that it was the defendant who in particular insisted that this clause be added.
Ultimately, Agent, why did you arrest Kara Bassett in today's case?
Well, ma'am, after performing our investigation, we found that the defendant had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit this crime.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions at this time.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Agent Branham.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Let's begin with the evidence you had collected when you arrested Miss Bassett. You arrested Miss Bassett in September of 2018, true?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
After conducting an investigation for a little over a year.
That's correct, ma'am.
In that time, you never found any eyewitnesses who saw Miss Bassett drag her husband's body into the swamp on August 18th, right?
No, ma'am, we were unable to find any eyewitnesses for that event.
You were also unable to find eyewitnesses who saw Miss Bassett travel over 270 miles across the state of Florida on August 18th, right?
That's correct, ma'am. No eyewitnesses reported seeing the van that night.
Well, Agent, let's move on to something else you didn't find. You canvassed Big Gum Swamp, right?
That's correct, ma'am.
Did that in late August of 2017.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
When you canvassed the swamp, you never found Don Clark's body, right?
No, ma'am, we were unable to recover the body.
Never found his keys.
No, we were not able to find Don Clark's car keys either.
Never able to find his phone.
That's correct.
Never able to find his wallet.
No, ma'am, we did not.
And that's not all. Mr. Cundy, can we get Exhibit 18 up for the jury? Agent, this is a syringe of carfentanil, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
But it's not the syringe of carfentanil you believe Miss Bassett used to kill her husband, right?
No, ma'am, that syringe was missing and unaccounted for.
Right. You never found that missing syringe.
No, ma'am, we were unable to recover that syringe.
And Agent, I want to talk about what that all means. Because you don't have a body, you don't have an autopsy, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Don't have a toxicology report.
No, as we were unable to perform an autopsy, we were also not able to obtain a toxicology report.
And because you never found that syringe of carfentanil, you don't have a fingerprint test of the alleged murder weapon, right?
No, ma'am, we do not.
And because you don't have a toxicology report, you don't know for sure that carfentanil was actually in Don Clark's system.
Not based on a toxicology report, no, ma'am.
Agent, we just talked about the evidence you didn't collect. Let's talk about the evidence you did collect. Now, you conducted a forensic test on samples of algae from Big Gum Swamp and Miss Bassett's boots, right?
That's correct, ma'am. We also tested algae found on a wheelchair and the driver's side floor of the van.
Mr. Cundy, can we get Exhibit 25 up for the jury? This is Kara Bassett's elephant park, right?
Yes, ma'am, I believe so.
This is an elephant park with a watering hole, true?
Yes, ma'am, as you can see in that picture.
You never tested that watering hole for algae, right?
No, ma'am, we did not.
In fact, you didn't collect a single sample of algae from anywhere on the natural landscape of Miss Bassett's residence, right?
No, ma'am, we did not test Mrs. Bassett's residence.
Agent, let's move now to something you didn't mention on direct examination. You believe you ruled out all possibilities of how Don Clark disappeared, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Let's talk about one of those possibilities. Mr. Cundy, can we get Exhibit 4 up for the jury? This is a letter from Don Clark's attorney to Agent Branham. Agent, you were aware of this letter when you arrested Kara Bassett, true?
Yes, ma'am, I reviewed this letter as a part of my investigation.
So you were aware that Don Clark had a vacation home in Costa Rica, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You were aware that Don Clark had off-the-books cash.
According to this letter, I was aware of that.
You were also aware that Don Clark wanted to keep that cash a secret from his wife.
Again, according to this letter, that is correct.
Agent, you were also aware that Don Clark made a phone call on August 18th, right?
Ma'am, which phone call are you referring to?
Don Clark made a phone call to an individual in Costa Rica on August 18th, true?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Agent, you have no idea who Don Clark talked to on the 18th.
No, ma'am, we were unable to determine the identity of the caller.
So you were also unable to determine what Don Clark talked about with this person.
No, ma'am, I was not able to determine what he was talking about.
But you're aware that conversation between Don Clark and the individual in Costa Rica lasted for 52 minutes, right?
That's correct, ma'am.
And hours. After Don Clark made that phone call, he disappeared.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Thank you, Agent. Nothing further.
Is there any redirect examination for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Agent Branham, on cross-examination, opposing counsel talked to a lot about Mr. Clark's connections to Costa Rica. I want to go back into that. Now, Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 4 back up, the opposing counsel just referenced it as a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney to Agent Steph Branham. Now, Agent Branham, were you aware if Mr. Clark had any plans regarding Costa Rica?
No, ma'am. To the contrary, this letter states that he had no plans of going to Costa Rica.
Right. And do you know if it's possible that Mr. Clark's vehicles could be in Costa Rica?
No, ma'am. I'm aware that that is not possible, as we checked for all of Mr. Clark's vehicles and found that only 2 of them were not present on his property.
And what 2 were not present on his property?
The van that I've mentioned previously, and also a Cessna airplane, which we found at the Cary Bell Leon Airport in Florida.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
No recross, Your Honor.
All right, sir, you are excused. And defense, I will have you, well, let me ask government, do you have any further witnesses?
No further witnesses, Your Honor. At this time, the people rest.
Defense, are you prepared to call your first witness? Should you present any?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Miss Jo Young.
And Ms. Young, you are under oath.
May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Miss Young.
Can you see me okay? I'm not used to being on this end of the camera.
Yes, we can see you fine, Miss Young.
Thank you.
Miss Young, what do you do for a living?
I'm a movie producer. I mainly work in reality TV or documentaries.
Do you know Kara Bassett?
I do. I worked with her on a documentary.
While you were working with Miss Bassett on your documentary, did you ever meet Don Clark?
I did. I got to be really close friends with him.
How often were you working at the Elephant Park for your documentary?
I began working in summer of 2015. I went 5 days a week, almost 8 hours a day, up until fall of 2018.
Miss Young, let's talk about the last day you ever saw Don Clark. What day was that?
I believe August 18th, 2017.
Did you speak to Mr. Clark on that day?
I did.
What happened during that conversation?
I was telling him that I was going to Mexico for a vacation. I wanted to make sure he knew I wouldn't be there. When he looked at his phone and his behavior just completely changed.
What do you mean by that?
All the color drained from his face. It was like he'd seen a ghost. he walked off and started talking into his cell.
Mr. Cundy, could we get Exhibit 21 up for the jury? Miss Young, do you recognize this?
Yes, these are Don Clark's phone records.
Have you seen these before?
I have. I was shown them in my interview with 64 Minutes.
Now, Miss Young, around what time was your conversation with Don Clark that you just mentioned?
It was at closing time, so around 6.
According to Don Clark's phone records, what happened on his phone at around the time you talked to him?
He received 2 text messages at 6 and also had an outgoing phone call to the same number.
Where was that number from?
It says San Jose, Costa Rica.
Miss Young, were any texts sent from this phone to Kara Bassett after this phone call?
Yeah, there was one. I think it was around 11 p.m. that day.
And what did that text say?
It just said going out for a while.
Miss Young, did you ever see Don Clark again after he made that phone call to the individual in Costa Rica?
No, I haven't seen him since.
Let's talk a little bit about the FBI's investigation now. Did you ever see the FBI at the Elephant Park?
I did.
What did you see the FBI doing at the park?
I saw them, I think, investigating. They were looking around the park. It was a little concerning to me.
What do you mean by concerning?
I saw them holding some objects at the park without gloves. I don't know. It didn't look like what I'd seen in CSI, you know?
What was an example of one of the objects you saw FBI agents handling without gloves?
I think it was an elephant trunk, like a syringe.
Miss Young, did you ever go look for Don Clark?
I did. I visited Costa Rica myself to look for him.
And did you find Mr. Clark?
No, I didn't find him in Costa Rica.
Did the FBI ever ask you about your trip to Costa Rica to look for Don Clark?
No, they never asked me about my trip.
Miss Young, how many hours of footage did you have from your time working at the park?
I'd say around 2,000 hours of footage.
Did the FBI ever ask to see that footage?
No, they never did.
Thank you, Miss Young. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Miss Young.
Good afternoon.
Now let's first talk about the defendant's vision for the Elephant Park. You met Kara Bassett sometime in 2015, right?
Yeah, I did.
And on the day you met her, she told you she wanted her elephant park to become the biggest sanctuary in the United States, right?
Yeah, she did. She was really passionate about her elephants.
Right. But from what you could see, Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett didn't always seem to agree on these plans. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they didn't always see eye to eye.
Right. You actually talked to the defendant about some of the disagreements on June 15th, 2017.
I did. I did a series of interviews with her that day.
Now, directing your attention to Exhibit 38 in your digital exhibit binder, let me know when you get there.
I got it.
This is one of the interview clips you filmed of Kara Bassett on June 15th.
Yes, it is.
And it hasn't been altered in any way since that date.
No.
At this time, we offer Exhibit 38 into evidence.
No objections to that, Your Honor.
That will be received into evidence.
And Miss Julian Kwong, if you can play that clip for the jury, please.
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Ms. Young, I want to go over exactly what was said in that clip. In that video clip, the defendant said she's tired of being underestimated, right?
Yes.
She said she'd do anything to protect the elephants.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And she said she'd take people to the grave if she had to. Those were her words.
Oh, yes.
Right. And just 2 months after she'd said she'd take people to the grave if she had to, Don Clark disappeared.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Ms. Young, on direct examination, you said you went to Costa Rica, right?
Yes, I did.
Right. You were there for at least a week.
Yes, that's correct.
And not once did you see Don Clark in Costa Rica.
No, I didn't see him.
Let's move to the defendant's behaviors after August 18th. Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 22 pulled up, which is a pre-admitted copy of the defendant's phone records from August 18th to August 26th. Now, Ms. Young, looking at this exhibit, the defendant didn't try to text her husband after he disappeared. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
The defendant didn't try to call her husband after he disappeared.
No.
Right. And the defendant waited until August 25th to call the FBI.
To call the Tallahassee Police Department, yeah.
Now, let's move to Kara Bassett's behavior after August 26th, when you got back from your trip to Mexico. Now, it's your testimony that Kara Bassett seemed devastated, right?
She did.
Now, this devastation only seemed to last about a week.
Yeah, that sounds about right. She started to pick herself back up and get back to work.
Right, so to around September 3rd.
That sounds correct, yeah.
Now, September 3rd was the same day the FBI left the elephant park, wasn't it?
Yeah, they left their full investigation. They started visiting once a month.
That's the yes to my question. September 3rd was the day the FBI left the elephant park.
Oh, yes.
So, Ms. Young, just to be clear here, the defendant stopped seeming outwardly sad on the same day the FBI left the elephant park.
Yes, that sounds right.
Now, let's talk about something the defendant had access to. Ms. Jillian Kwong, if we can get Exhibit 18 pulled up, which is a pre-admitted photograph of a syringe of elephant tranquilizer. Now, Ms. Young, you saw these syringes at the park before, right?
Oh, yeah, I have.
Right. They're kept in a storage unit.
Yes, that's correct.
It's locked.
Oh, yes.
But you've seen the defendant have access to these syringes. True?
Yes, that's correct. She was one of the employees with the key.
Nothing further.
No redirect, Your Honor. May this witness please be excused?
Yes, you may be excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, Your Honor, the defense rests.
All right. As both parties have rested, we will proceed with closing arguments unless there's anything we need to address first. Anything from the government before we proceed to closings?
No, Your Honor.
Anything from the defense before we proceed to closings?
No, Your Honor.
All right. I will remind our scoring jurors to go ahead and switch back to speaker view so that we can have a better view for closing arguments. And government, whenever you are ready, you may proceed with your closing argument.
Yes, Your Honor. She wanted control. She killed for it. On August 18th, 2017, the defendant was tired. She was tired of telling her husband what she wanted, sanctuary, and getting nothing in return. She was tired of being ignored. She was tired of being told no. There was a limit to her patience, and on August 18th, it finally ran out. So what'd she do? She killed her husband. She grabbed a syringe of a lethal drug and she injected it into him. And then she disposed of his body. A week later, she notified the FBI. She hoped the FBI would just see right past the truth. But members of the jury, they didn't. We didn't. Because today, the truth is clear. The defendant wanted control, and she killed for it. That's why today we have charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with the murder of Dawn Clark. And as the people, we had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant killed her husband and that she did so with malice aforethought. Members of the jury, let's walk through the evidence we brought today to help us meet that burden. Now, today you learned that the defendant had a motive. That in May of 2017, Mr. Clark signed his power of attorney over to Kara Bassett. Death, disability, disappearance, those were the conditions of the document. Now, members of the jury, that might seem normal to you, but it's not. In fact, you heard today that never before had Mr. Clark's attorney seen a disappearance clause. And who asked for that clause to be included? The defendant. And just 1 month later, the defendant, she filmed this video.
I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Members of the jury, the defendant was tired of being underestimated. Do not underestimate her today. Because on August 18th, 2017, the defendant followed through with her threat. And today you learned exactly how. First, you learned about the defendant's murder weapon, a syringe of a drug called carfentanil. Now you learned today that carfentanil is lethal to humans. And the defendant knew that. In fact, she told Agent Branham that just a few drops could kill a man. Now, up until August 18th, not a single syringe of carfentanil had ever gone missing before. But right when Dawn Clark disappears, one does. Members of the jury, the defendant used that syringe to kill her husband. And then you learned exactly what the defendant did after she killed her husband. GPS evidence from Mr. Clark's van shows his vehicle was driven 2 hours across Florida to Big Gum Swamp. It was dark. It was secluded. It was the perfect place for the defendant to dispose of her husband's body. And members of the jury, we know the defendant was at that swamp. You learned today that Big Gum Swamp is home to a rare combination of algae. The same combination of algae was found on the boots the defendant wore on August 18th and on the driver's side of the van driven to that swamp that very same night. Now, members of the jury, it's not a coincidence. The defendant used the syringe. The defendant wanted control, and she killed for it. Now, in a few minutes, opposing counsel, they're going to get up for their closing arguments, and they're going to tell you that Dawn Clark left for a new life in Costa Rica. Members of the jury, that theory, it's just not reasonable. You heard today that Mr. Clark had 2 modes of transportation that would have allowed him to get off to Costa Rica, a van and an airplane. Both of those were still in Florida on August 18th. Both of those were still in Florida when the FBI searched them on August 25th. And the reason they both were in Florida was because Mr. Clark never left to Costa Rica. He didn't get the chance. The defendant wanted control. She killed him. Today, we've met our burden. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Closing argument from the defense.
You may proceed. You may proceed.
He had a plan. She wasn't part of it. Members of the jury, on August 18th, 2017, Dawn Clark abandoned his wife. He had his off-the-books cash ready to go, a vacation home set up for him there, and secrets upon secrets that ensured his wife had no idea what was happening. because Miss Bassett wasn't aware of her husband's plans, but the government is holding her responsible anyway. And they can't just tell you she's guilty. They have the highest burden in our criminal justice system, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's walk through the evidence that they presented you with today. Agent Branham told you about samples of algae. He told you he believes samples of algae from Big Gum Swamp match samples from Miss Bassett's boots. Members of the jury, what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is Kara Bassett's residence. It's a home with a watering hole, a home with trees, a home with dirt, the perfect environment for algae to grow, an environment that Agent Branham searched for a full week. And yet Agent Branham didn't collect a single sample of algae from Miss Bassett's residence. Why? Because you heard today, finding a sample of algae from Big Gum Swamp would point towards Miss Bassett's guilt, but finding a sample of algae from the Elephant Park would only point towards her innocence, so Agent Branham chose one side of the story to present to his forensic analyst, chose to only present that side of the story to you in trial today. Members of the jury, that is not forensic proof. That's an assumption. And that incomplete analysis of algae is the only piece of physical evidence the government presented you with today. At the beginning of today's trial, I asked you 3 questions. Did the government ever find any eyewitnesses? You heard the answer to that question is no. Agent Branham didn't find a single eyewitness who saw Miss Bassett travel over 270 miles across the state of Florida on the night of August 18th. I asked you if the FBI ever recovered Don Clark's body. The answer to that question is also no. The government told you they know exactly where that body is. They told you it's in Big Gum Swamp. They're sure of it. Members of the jury, they never found that body. I asked you if the FBI ever recovered a murder weapon. You heard the answer to that is also no. Now, the government just told you that because a syringe of carfentanil went missing, it had to be the murder weapon. Members of the jury, that is not the standard they had to meet today. Agent Branham never found that alleged murder weapon. They haven't met their burden because their case boils down to an incomplete analysis of algae. That's it. So what happens when we look beyond Agent Branham's investigation? Well, the government told you over and over again today that Miss Bassett and her husband, they had a tense relationship. They didn't always get along. Members of the jury, we completely agree with that. But that relationship didn't just affect Miss Bassett, it also affected Mr. Clark, and for all their talk about a tense relationship, the government never considered the possibility that Don Clark wanted a new life away from Kara Bassett. So let's consider that possibility. Because you heard Don Clark didn't just have a motive to go to Costa Rica, he also had the capability to get there. You heard he had a substantial amount of off-the-books cash. Enough cash to buy another property in Costa Rica, not that he would need to because he already had a vacation home set up for him there. Now, it's true. We don't know exactly how Don Clark got to Costa Rica. But what we do know is that Don Clark made a phone call on August 18th. A phone call that lasted for 52 minutes to an unidentified individual in Costa Rica. Members of the jury, we don't know. Did Don Clark board a commercial air flight on the 18th? Did Don Clark's contact rent him a car? Did Don Clark's contact charter him a plane? Members of the jury, we don't have the answers to any of these questions because the FBI never looked into it. The truth is, Agent Branham, with all the resources of the FBI and the United States government behind him, couldn't be bothered to fly a few hours to Costa Rica to see if Don Clark is still alive. Couldn't be bothered to find that individual Don Clark spoke to just hours before he disappeared. Couldn't be bothered to trace Don Clark's off-the-books cash. Why? What was Agent Branham so afraid to find? Members of the jury, you don't have to believe that Don Clark is alive and well in Costa Rica. You just have to believe it was reasonable enough for the FBI to have looked into it. That was the standard the government had to meet today. They had to leave you with no reasonable questions. Agent Branham had a responsibility to follow every reasonable lead, to answer all of those questions. Members of the jury, Agent Branham and the United States government failed. You don't have to make the same mistake. Find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor?
Yes, you may proceed.
Opposing counsel just told you in their closing arguments that Kara Bassett and Don Clark had a tense relationship. Members of the jury, we agree with that. They did. They had different visions for the elephant park. They thought about it again and again and again, year after year. But opposing counsel also just told you that that tense relationship, it was the reason Don Clark left for a new life in Costa Rica. Members of the jury, let's think about that story. Because what opposing counsel needs you to believe is that Mr. Clark decided to, because he didn't like his wife anymore, to pick up and leave, but leave all of his assets with Kara Bassett. He didn't like his wife, he wanted to leave, but she got his elephant park. He didn't like his wife, he wanted to leave, but he'd leave her behind the $8 million in assets. Members of the jury, that's not the behavior of someone who hated their wife so much they wanted to leave the country. That's not the behavior of someone who wanted to leave the country, because Don Clark didn't leave the country. Opposing counsel just told you that they don't know how Don Clark got to Costa Rica, that he could have got a commercial flight, could have chartered a car. But members of the jury, if Don Clark wanted to leave for a new life, why would he just not take his plane or his van or any of his other vehicles? The reason he wouldn't take those vehicles is because he didn't go to Costa Rica. You heard today when Joe Young went, she didn't even find Mr. Clark, and she was there for 7 whole days investigating. Members of the jury, today Don Clark didn't have a plan. Kara Bassett had a plan. And unfortunately, Don Clark was a part of that plan. His death was a part of that plan, because Miss Bassett knew that if she killed him, she'd get the elephant park. So she wanted control. And she killed for it. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. Scoring judges, I'll ask you to now make sure you submit your ballots. So give us a moment to do that. And I've been asked to note that your ballot